He took off his coat slowly and hung it on the hook, and then he turned to me and he said, "Your mother told me, before the wedding. She called me and she told me everything, and she asked me not to say anything to you because she believed you needed to come to it yourself. I have been waiting for you to tell me for 11 years. I am not sure how long I stood in the hallway. It felt like a long time. The kitchen was behind me with a 19-year-old at the table, and my husband was in front of me, having just told me that the secret I had been carrying alone for 11 years of our marriage had not, in fact, been carried alone. That he had known. That he had married me knowing. That he had sat across from me through the fertility appointments and the adoption paperwork, and every evening of our life together holding a truth that was mine to tell, and had waited, with the patience that was his most particular quality, for me to find my way to it. I said, "You knew the whole time and you never said anything?" He said, "It wasn't mine to say." I said, "You must have been angry." He said, "I was sad for you. There's a difference." And then he looked past me at the kitchen and said, "Is that him?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Then let's go and meet him properly." What happened in the hours that followed is something I have turned over many times, trying to understand the shape of it. Kieran sat down across from Tomasz at our kitchen table, and he introduced himself and he asked questions with the easy, genuine interest of a man who has spent his professional life being curious about people, and Tomasz, who had come in frightened and careful and prepared for the worst, began, slowly and then more quickly, to relax into the conversation the way young people relax when they feel they are being taken seriously. They talked about computer science and about Krakow and about the things Tomasz had seen in Dublin in the 3 days he had been there. I sat beside my husband and watched my son talk to him and felt something I do not have adequate words for, something that was grief and relief and gratitude and a kind of awe at the strangeness of the path that had led all three of us to this kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in October. Tomasz stayed for dinner. I cooked badly because I was too distracted to cook properly, and Kieran supplemented what I produced with bread and cheese and a pragmatic cheerfulness that kept the table from feeling as strange as it was. Tomasz had his adoptive mother's, recipe for żurek, he told us, which is a Polish sour rye soup that I had been making for 15 years in Dublin whenever I was homesick. And we talked about the soup for longer than the topic probably warranted because we were all using it as cover for the enormous other thing that was happening, which is what people do at tables when what is happening is too large to address directly. After he left, he had a hostel in the city center, a flight back to Krakow the following weekend. I sat with Kieran in the living room for a long time without turning the lights on. The street outside was doing its Dublin thing, the particular orange light of Irish street lamps through curtains, a sound of rain starting. I asked Kieran why he had never asked me about it, never pressed me all those years. He thought about it for a moment and then he said, "Because I could see it was something you were carrying, and I trusted that you would put it down when you were ready. And because I thought that pushing you toward it before you were ready might make you run away from it faster." I said, "What if I had never been ready?" He said, "Then that would have been your choice to make, not mine." I thought about my mother, who had made a choice for me at 22 that I had blamed her for in the private part of myself for 20 years. The part that I did not examine too often because what I found there was complicated and uncomfortable. My mother, who had seen a situation she could not fix and had moved to fix it in the only way she knew, who had also, apparently, called my future husband before my wedding to pass the secret to someone she trusted to hold it more carefully than she had. I thought about what it costs to love someone who is making choices you disagree with and to stay anyway. To stay without requiring them to become the person you need them to be on your timeline rather than theirs. My mother had done that in her way. Ciaran had done it in his. I had been surrounded by people loving me carefully, and I had been too inside my own fear to see it. I called my mother the next morning. She answered on the second ring. I told her that Tomasz had come. She was quiet for so long that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said in Polish, "How does he look?" I told her he had my father's jaw. She made a sound that was not quite a word, something between grief and relief, the sound of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has just been allowed to put it down. I told her he seemed good, careful and serious, and a little frightened but good. She said, "I hoped he would be." I said, "Why didn't you tell me you called Ciaran?" She said, "Because I thought you might not marry him if you knew I had interfered, and I could see he was the right man." There was a pause, and then she said, "Was I wrong?" I thought about the kitchen table the night before, the bread and cheese and Jurek soup and the orange streetlight, and 11 years of a man who had known and had waited. I said, "No, Mama, you weren't wrong. Tomasz and I have been in contact since that October. We are learning what we are to each other, which has no established template, no cultural script to follow. He is not my son in the daily sense. He has parents who raised him, a life in Krakow that is fully formed and fully his. But he is my son in the original sense, the irreducible sense, and he seems to be navigating that with a grace that I think comes from having grown up knowing he was adopted, and therefore having had time to develop a more flexible understanding of what family means than most people arrive at. He calls every few weeks. We have met in person 3 times. Once he came back to Dublin, once I went to Krakow, and he showed me the city and the apartment where he grew up, and introduced me to his parents, the Wiśniewskis, which was one of the stranger afternoons of my life, and also, unexpectedly, one of the most moving. Pani Wiśniewska made coffee, and they asked me about Dublin and about how I had ended up there, and they were, as my mother had told me when I was 22, good people. Pan Wiśniewski said, at one point, "We always hoped he would find you, not because we weren't enough, but because a person should know the whole story of themselves, if they can." I thanked him and meant it more completely than any thanks I can remember giving. The adoption process we had started is still ongoing. Ireland's timeline has not shortened, but something has changed in how I think about it, because the experience of watching Tomasz walk through my door, a grown person, someone I had carried and placed in another family's arms and loved from a careful distance for 17 years, gave me a different kind of understanding of what waiting for a child means and what it can become. I am less afraid of the uncertainty now. I have seen what comes after. Ciaran and I talked, one night recently, about the 11 years he had held my secret without my knowing. I asked him if it had been hard. He said some things were harder than others. The fertility appointments in particular, he said, knowing what he knew and not being able to say it. I asked him if he wished I had told him myself, if he had resented the fact that he had found out from my mother rather than from me. He thought about it honestly, the way he thinks about things. Then he said, "I think I understood why you couldn't, and I loved you more for the thing you had been carrying than I was angry about the carrying." I did not know what to say to that. He said, "I also knew you would get there eventually. You always do." I still walk past the hole sometimes, the one that was there for 17 years. It is smaller now, not gone. I think it will always be there in some form because it is the shape of something real that happened, and real things leave real marks, and I have stopped trying to pretend otherwise. But there is also something in its place now, something that was not there before. A thread that runs from a kitchen table in Dublin to a city in southern Poland and back again, through a gray jacket and my father's jaw and a bowl of Zurich soup, and a man who knew and waited and a mother who interfered and was right. The thread is thin and new, and I am careful with it. But it is there. It is real. And some mornings, when the Dublin light is doing its particular thing through the kitchen window, and I am making coffee and thinking about all the ways a life can turn out differently than you expected, I hold the thin new thread and I think this too was always part of the story. I just couldn't see it from where I was standing.